Hey, how about a pragmatic debate? And this is what Americans and Europeans don't understand. I've spent my life debating, and by debate, I don't mean people think of debate as like, screw you, you're wrong, no, screw you, that's not debate. I'm talking about formal debate, debating the principles of something. Truly a platonic debate. Most people don't know what a platonic debate is anyway, but, a logical, quasi-formal debate on if you think that the megapixel wars have gotten out of hand. I mean, the top of the line ultra low light performer on Nikon's end is the D4S. It's a 16 megapixel camera. Now, I can see the advantages of having a very small advantage. Nevertheless, I can see the advantages of having the new 50 megapixel Canon. However, all that is a FX sensor with DX pixel density. For example, the much beloved Nikon D7100 that many of you own, if the photo sites were scaled up to the full frame size, in other words, if the photo site density was kept the same and the sensor were larger, I believe it would be a 47 megapixel camera. And of course, every sensor has a potential for greater output on the megapixels. What they're sampled at and what they're truly capable of as far as maximum transmission are two different things. Specifically, the Canon 50 megapixel sensor on its flagship DSLR, I think, specs out at technically capable of 62 megapixels. However, as is the case with buffer and transfer speeds and whatnot, to keep all that in an acceptable tolerance of what consumers like, it is sampled at 50.1 megapixels. So anyway, like these 16 megapixel Fujis, of course they both have the same sensor and they both have the same processor, the Fuji X-T1 and the X-T10, as well as the 16 megapixel Nikon D4S, or even the 12 megapixel Nikon D700, or my 12 megapixel darling Nikon D3s. Those are still exquisite cameras. The question is, do you think that anything has changed in the past 15 years? And the answer is no, it has not changed. Advantages of having ultra high high megapixel camera. Obviously, photo site density is important for like a nature photographer who's got a 500 millimeter f3.5 lens, and take a picture of a rare little birdie at 1,000 yards away, and you have to crop the piss snot out of the digital negative, the raw file. That's understandable. However, like my Nikon D810s, I've got a pair of them, 36 megapixel cameras. Lovely, even though I have a top-of-the-line computer with a quad-core processor that I process those digital negatives on, with the 32 gig of RAM and quad-core there's still a pain in the crotch. And this is why more than, I think, 3 Canon shooters of the Canon 50 megapixel camera, they're shooting almost entirely JPEGs, which is a good thing and a bad thing. I understand they want to have the high megapixel density output, but they don't want to have to mess with the exquisitely huge raw files. It is the case that currently that even the 36 megapixel Nikon D810s that I have, like I said, even with the top of the line computer, it's just a pain in the crotch to deal with those digital negatives, those raw files. And Nikon and Canon know this. They've actually been sitting on this potential now for about 5 or 6 years. But I mean, if you bring out a camera that is such a pain to deal with the digital negative on your computer that you want to chop your own head off, then obviously, you've got an issue. All digital photography is a double-sided shotgun, or actually, that's kind of a bad analogy. You got a two-part process. I mean, the same thing in developing. It's like having a film camera that there's no processing chemicals for. It's like, well, great, this camera produces exquisite film output at incredibly tight grain, but you got to send it off to Kodak labs like Kodachrome or something. Well, that's a pain in the crotch. And that's one of the major demises of Kodachrome, regardless of what its output was. The same issue with digital photography and that, well, you could shoot these ultra high megapixel shots, but if you have this $3,000 camera like a Nikon D810, you know, and you're only utilizing part of its potential by shooting exclusively in JPEGs, then you're not squeezing the orange juice for more than about 70% or 60% of its juice, actually about half. You know, you've got this exquisitely expensive DSLR and you're shooting JPEGs? Are you kidding me? Like, well, rationally it's understandable because, you know, you don't want to screw around with the huge RAW files. And I understand that. I suffer that same problem too. And the question is the premise is that nothing has changed as far as printing or magazine ads or weddings. Nothing has changed in 20 years. Things have actually gotten, you know, things have gotten easier. I mean, we've gone to Facebook and, you know, Flickr. And, you know, the worst excuse for actually squeezing the hell out of your DSLR as far as photo site density and having a high megapixel camera is, of course, still nature photography, of course, and wedding photography. But 20 by 30s have remained 20 by 30s now. You know, even back when I was in photography school, you know, you went 20 by 30. Okay, 20 by 30. Rarely would somebody want a poster. And it's like, well, okay, you got a lot less grain now. You have this 36 megapixel or 50 megapixel RAW file that you could print a poster out on. Well, that's fine. You know, if you can justify those costs and that's what you're doing for a business, that's great. But rationally speaking, there are, I put forward to you that there are very few of you that can actually rationalize the need for anything more than the 16 megapixel camera. And even your Nikon D7100s, and God knows there's countless thousands of you that bought the Nikon D7100 off my recommendation, and it is an exquisitely good recommendation. Right now the camera is just stupid cheap. I mean, it's just an incredible value. And, you know, I think there's nothing short of 100% feedback on that camera. Everybody's just happier than a worm in a pile of poo. And, you know, I'm glad for that. But the question remains is what sort of rationality do you draw in lusting after, you know, these ultra high megapixel cameras? I'm not talking about FX versus DX. Say Fuji comes out next year with a DX sensor with tighter photo site density. I mean, it'd be great for birding, of course. And come out with, say, you know, a 32 megapixel DX sensor. I mean, rationally, do you actually need that? Or is it you're pathetic? And I suffer from this as well. I mean, however, I also do weigh the choices between rational convictions as far as what I actually need versus what I want to get something done, whether it's a job or just puttering around taking shots of what I want. I mean, what is it that you're using it for? I mean, do you plan on 10 years from now having a gigantic RAW file with a new type of RAW processor application that is going to extract something that you're currently unable to do? I mean, nothing has changed. You know, the necessity for ultra high megapixel cameras is not there. It is not only not growing, it has actually shrunk from what it was even 15 years ago, or even from the days of film. I mean, it has actually shrunk. Wildlife photography back then, the desire for tight grain of the silver halides was high then, and is still high now. Nature photographers need it. You don't really need it for 99% of wedding photography. I mean, what rocked out as a great wedding shot with a Nikon D3 back, you know, a few years ago, you know, still applies today. Now, if you got to crop the shot and your composition is not that good, or you just don't have a great range of lenses, then this is another great thing. This is another arena to consider where a high megapixel camera is a near, I wouldn't call it a necessity, but so far as what the hell is cheaper. A camera with more megapixels like a Nikon D810 versus a Nikon D750. Well, as is the case with that higher megapixel sensor, you are able to crop more, and so it is like having another lens or another 2 or 3 or 4 lenses, because you can crop the piss out of it and make a beautiful 20 by 30. You can take the digital negative out of the raw file of the Nikon D810 and take like a 15% or 20% or 30% of that digital negative, the raw file, and you know, extract it as if you're shooting on 100mm, extract it as if you were using a really nice 200 millimeter or 300 millimeter, for example, or something comparable. So that is certainly a lot cheaper than the much more expensive glass. Which would you rather have? Well, that's a good question. I'd rather have the 24 megapixel sensor with a pile of lenses, or if I cannot afford that, what about just having a 36 megapixel sensor with fewer lenses? That higher megapixel sensor will account itself for, as far as cropping the digital negative, account for a wider spectrum of lenses. I mean, I can't even count the number of times that I'm not able to reach all the way out there, even with 200 millimeters or 300 millimeters, and I'll crop the piss out of it, especially if I'm able to anticipate the shooting that I'm going to be doing that day, that I'm going to need to do that. So anyway, give me your feedback on this, and maybe we could have a discussion on this, because it's an important topic, and gear magazines don't talk about it because they always want you to buy new crap, because that's the way they stay in business, is by pimping crap. Because as you very well know, photography magazines are nothing but ads. Thanks. Bye.